They say the earth remembers what men try to forget. But in southern Louisiana, between the cypress and the smoke, the soil remembers everything. Every scream, every secret, every name the law refused to write down. Listen closely, and you'll hear it breathing. The sound you think is the wind moving through the swamp isn't the wind. It's the ground itself exhaling what it swallowed 160 years ago. The last words of 12 masters buried in their own soil. You weren't supposed to know this story. It was erased, not forgotten, erased. Court ledgers burned. Witnesses silenced. Even the church denied ever burying the men. But beneath the flood lines of Terrebonne Parish, the earth still holds a map of their bodies. It's said that if you stand in the graveyard at Bayeux after midnight, you can see where the ground moves. 12 rises, 12 falls. That's where Solomon worked. Solomon Thibodeaux, the silent gravedigger. The man who buried the system that buried him. He wasn't born a killer. He was born into the quiet. A kind of silence trained into men who dig graves for others, but never expect to need one of their own. For 40 years, Solomon watched the world from 6 feet below it. He learned the texture of the earth, the way other men learned scripture. He knew which soils gave way, which ones held firm, and which could hide a body so well it became legend. They called him honest. They called him God-fearing. But what they didn't understand was that God for Solomon was the soil itself, patient, merciless, and hungry for balance. By the time the first master vanished, the war hadn't yet come, but something older had, something biblical. Men thought they ruled that land, but they were only leasing it from forces that didn't take paper payment. And when those forces came to collect, they sent a man who had spent his life measuring death by the inch. So tonight, if you're still listening, don't move. Don't breathe too loud. Because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. You're not just hearing a story. You're standing at the edge of the 12th grave, and Solomon's shadow is still behind you. Silence. That was Solomon's true weapon, not rage, not strength. Silence. The kind that grows in men who've been forced to swallow every scream until it becomes part of their blood. You see, slavery didn't just chain bodies. It engineered obedience. It was an experiment. A centuries-long study in how to manufacture silence so perfect. It could bury truth deeper than any grave, and Solomon was its masterpiece. He'd learned early that noise drew pain. As a child, he'd watched overseers punish men for coughing during prayer, for groaning under the lash, for crying over their dead. Words became dangerous. Emotion became evidence. The safest man was the quiet one, the one who made himself invisible while the world rotted around him. That's how he survived. By listening. And what he heard changed him forever. He heard confessions whispered over open graves, masters begging for mercy from a God they'd never shown mercy to, priests offering absolution to men who killed in daylight and knelt at night. He heard the soft weeping of mothers, forced to bury their own children without markers, without names. And somewhere in that symphony of cruelty and cowardice, something inside Solomon hardened, because when you dig long enough in other people's dirt, you stop fearing death. You start understanding it. You start hearing its rhythm. Solomon realized death was never random. It was administered, managed, and sold like everything else. He began to see the pattern. The same hands that claimed to own him also controlled the narrative, the history, the scripture, the law. They buried truth as skillfully as they buried people. And he, the gravedigger, had been helping them do it. That realization was his awakening. It's the same one every man has when he looks deep enough into power, when he realizes that silence isn't peace, it's complicity. That's the moment a man either breaks or transforms. Solomon didn't break. They thought they'd trained him to obey. In truth, they'd trained him to understand burial, how to hide things so perfectly the world forgets they existed. But knowledge is never neutral. Once you master the act of hiding, you also master the art of revealing. And so, while the masters slept believing their sins were beneath notice, Solomon began counting names, faces, graves, and debts, because every system built on silence eventually meets the one man who remembers everything. They called it order. They called it civilization. But what they built on those plantations wasn't order. It was control disguised as divine right. The 13th rule of control was simple: make the victim grateful for their cage. Solomon understood that long before the men who ruled him realized their kingdom was already cracking from within. Every system that governs men, from empires to corporations, survives through invisible obedience. You don't need chains if you own a man's perception. You don't need whips if you convince him that rebellion is sin. And that was the true brilliance of the Southern Order. It baptized submission. They turned the Bible into a ledger and the pulpit into a plantation office. They taught men to confuse fear with faith and hierarchy with heaven. Solomon had seen it all. He'd buried priests beside their parishioners, overseers beside the bodies they broke. He dug for the same families that used his hands to erase their crimes. And while the church bells rang over the sugar fields, Solomon noticed something the rest of them missed. The men who claimed to own souls were the ones most terrified of death. They preached eternity but feared burial. They wore gold crosses while begging not to be covered in the dirt they'd forced others into. That's when Solomon began writing. Small, coded marks carved into the undersides of wooden grave markers, invisible to casual eyes. He wrote no words, only symbols, spirals, crossed spades, and parallel lines that meant balance must return. Each grave became a message, a ledger of debt recorded not on paper, but in soil. He wasn't planning vengeance yet. He was mapping it. What you must understand is this: Solomon's rebellion wasn't born from impulse. It was method, precision, patience. He had spent 40 years perfecting the dimensions of death. 6 feet deep, 8 long, 3 wide. The geometry of justice disguised as labor. Every grave he dug was a rehearsal. Every coffin he lowered was a lesson in the weight of consequence. And when he finally decided to reverse the ritual, to place the masters in the ground they believed they owned, he wasn't breaking the rules, he was fulfilling them. The 13th rule of control is that power always consumes itself. Solomon merely handed them the shovels. Every gravedigger knows the geometry of death. It's not random. It's measured, balanced, precise. Depth, width, alignment. Each one matters. But Solomon understood something deeper. The earth itself has a memory for symmetry. For every wound opened, it demands one closed. For every injustice buried, it will one day exhume another. He'd seen it happen. Floods uncovering bones that were never supposed to rise, coffins pushed up through wet ground like confessions, refusing to stay quiet. The soil, he said once, was not a grave. It was a witness. And in 1857, that witness had grown restless. The parishes smelled of rot. The cane fields gleamed red after rain, as if the land itself was bleeding. The masters ignored it. They thought they'd conquered nature. But Solomon, the man they called silent, could feel it. The ground vibrating beneath his boots when he walked to work at dawn. It was almost like the earth was calling names. He started to measure differently then. His shovel moved slower, more deliberate. He began marking spots not by death dates, but by balance points, for every innocent buried without a prayer. He found a place waiting for the guilty. It wasn't madness, it was mathematics, the physics of the spiritual world. The masters believed in ownership, Solomon believed in weight, and when the weight of their cruelty finally equaled the patience of the soil, the equation would solve itself. He'd seen too many bodies lowered without ceremony. Children whose bones he could lift in one hand, women whose eyes were still open as he covered their faces with dirt. He'd felt his father's words echo through him, Every grave must rest true, Solomon. Every soul must lie even. Only now, Solomon realized the old man hadn't meant level ground. He'd meant cosmic balance. That was the night Solomon stopped being the parish gravedigger and became something older, something the records couldn't name. His hands no longer just shaped the earth. They listened to it. And what the earth whispered was clear. It's time. So he walked out beneath the dripping moss, his lantern swinging, and began drawing the first line of a map only he could read, a map that connected 12 graves, and 12 men who didn't yet know they'd already been measured for them. It began with the sound of rain against wood. That hollow, rhythmic tapping only a gravedigger would recognize. Solomon always said rain was the earth's way of remembering. But that week, it didn't feel like memory. It felt like warning. The sky stayed black for 9 days, as if refusing to open its eyes. On the 10th, the first man vanished. Ezekiel Rowan, plantation overseer, proud of his cruelty, the kind who laughed while others begged. He'd whipped a boy to death for dropping a lantern. That same lantern was found outside the parish cemetery gate the morning Ezekiel disappeared. No body, no blood, just that faint smell of turned soil and damp iron. The townsfolk whispered swamp spirits. But Solomon knew better. The swamp doesn't bury men in straight lines. He went about his work as usual. Quiet, efficient, unblinking. When they asked if he'd seen anything, he shook his head. But his eyes were calm, the kind of calm that made men uneasy. 2 nights later, another man vanished, then another, always near the line of 12 graves he'd drawn in the dirt behind the church. The pattern no one else noticed. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. The disappearances followed the map he'd carved weeks earlier beneath the old oak's roots. Each burial ground mirrored the crimes of the man it would take. The preacher who sold souls under scripture vanished near the chapel well. The merchant who traded children for silver disappeared behind the sugar barn. And every time, the earth settled just slightly, as though sighing in relief. The town grew hysterical. They prayed harder, whipped harsher, and dug deeper, but they never dug in the right place. They looked up for salvation while Solomon looked down into the soil, where every sin eventually returned home. He'd begun to perform small rituals before each disappearance. Silent gestures only the dead could see. A coin placed under a stone, a thread tied to a root. He called it, setting the weight right. No words, no curses. Just balance restored grain by grain. By the time the 12th man vanished, the parish had stopped asking questions. The ground was quiet again. The graves lay even. And Solomon, the silent man with the steady hands, went back to digging, not for others, but for what still waited beneath his own name. There should have only been 12. 12 men for 12 graves, balance complete, debt paid, silence restored. But the earth, it seemed, had one more name to call. The 13th grave wasn't on Solomon's map. It appeared one morning after a storm, a shallow hollow behind the churchyard, as if something beneath the surface had exhaled. The ground was soft, the edges clean, the dimensions perfect. 6 feet by 3, Solomon's signature. But he hadn't dug it. He stood over it at dawn, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and for the first time in years, his hands trembled. The soil looked fresh, yet no one had touched it. No tracks, no spade marks, no sound of digging during the night. The townsfolk hadn't noticed. They rarely saw what didn't serve them, but Solomon saw everything. The grave wasn't waiting for another master. It was waiting for him. He could feel it, a pull beneath his feet, like gravity had chosen him. The balance he'd restored had come to collect its final weight. All justice demands sacrifice. All equations end in equilibrium. He'd thought he could stand outside the pattern, the hand that guided the scale, but never weighed upon it. But the soil doesn't distinguish between sinner and witness. The ground remembers only the hands that feed it. That night, Solomon sat by the fire, the same shovel leaning against his knee, the same one that had buried every man he'd erased. The metal gleamed dull in the flickering light, reflecting not his face, but 12 others behind him, blurred and swaying like shadows underwater. He whispered to them, not in words but in breath. He asked if balance was satisfied. The silence that answered was endless. At dawn, the villagers found his cabin empty. The door was open, the fire cold, the shovel gone. They followed faint footprints toward the cemetery, but they stopped at the 13th grave. The earth there was smooth, newly pressed, as if finished by an expert hand. No one dug to check, no one said his name again. Years later, when floods tore through the parish, 12 graves rose. Bones scattered, markers vanished, but the 13th stayed untouched. Perfect, unbroken, as if the earth itself refused to let him go. For weeks after Solomon's disappearance, the parish moved as if under a spell. The air grew heavy, dense with something unspeakable. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that makes men whisper even when alone. The slaves no longer sang in the fields. The overseers stopped whistling on their horses. Even the bells at the chapel rang softer, their echoes swallowed by the fog that rolled in each morning from the marsh. It was as if the land itself had fallen into mourning, or warning. They said Solomon's ghost lingered near the churchyard, watching those who passed the 13th grave. Some claimed they heard shovels scraping faintly beneath the soil. Others swore they saw footprints appear after rain, only to vanish when approached. But those were stories for the frightened. The truth was quieter, more dangerous. Solomon hadn't left behind a ghost. He'd left behind an idea, and ideas don't die. They germinate. Men who once mocked him began dreaming of him. They woke drenched in sweat, remembering his face, the calm in his eyes, the rhythm of his breath as he worked. And in those dreams, Solomon didn't speak. He only pointed, downward, toward the earth, toward the truth. Each man woke with the same thought: the ground is listening. One overseer quit without explanation, leaving his post and wandering into the woods. Another confessed his cruelty to the preacher, trembling, saying he felt the weight following him. The preacher, once certain of heaven, stopped preaching altogether. He spent his days staring at the cemetery from his window, muttering that God's silence now sounded like Solomon's shovel. The silence spread, not as emptiness but as presence. It was in the pause before prayer, in the stillness between breaths. It was in the soil under every man's boots, a constant reminder that nothing buried stays forgotten. By the end of that harvest, 12 new hands had taken up Solomon's old shovel, not to bury, but to dig, not for bodies, but for truth. They called themselves the Quiet Ones, working under moonlight, uncovering what history had tried to hide. They didn't speak his name aloud. They didn't need to. The silence was the message. Because once Solomon taught men to listen, they could never stop hearing what the earth was trying to say. They emerged slowly, like roots after a storm. The Quiet Ones, 12 men and women who had worked beside Solomon, watched his silence, and finally understood it. They were not chosen by him. They were chosen by the earth that remembered him. Each of them carried something of Solomon's: a glove, a rusted nail, a thread from his shirt. But what bound them wasn't relics. It was knowledge that history could be rewritten underground. At night, when the fields slept and the masters dreamed of profit, the Quiet Ones gathered behind the old church, lanterns dimmed, hands blackened with clay. There, beneath a dying cypress, they began what came to be known only in whispers as the Book of Soil. It wasn't a book of paper. It was a map drawn in dirt and blood, recording every grave, every injustice, every name erased by power. They pressed their palms into the mud to sign it, leaving prints instead of letters. To them, the earth was the only witness worth trusting. They believed Solomon's 13th grave wasn't an ending, but a seed, that his disappearance was an offering, a surrender of flesh to awaken the land itself. And so they continued his work, not with shovels alone, but with silence, patience, and ritual. Every burial from then on was done differently. No prayers from the preacher, no hymns from the book, just quiet, a bowed head, and the phrase Solomon had once carved beneath a coffin lid, "Nothing stays buried forever." A word began to spread. Field hands whispered to one another when the wind moved through the cane. Soft, rhythmic, like breath beneath soil. Overseers felt watched but saw no eyes. The land grew uneasy again. The masters couldn't name it, but they felt it. That creeping sense that something beneath their feet was remembering. One night, the oldest of the quiet ones, a man named Elias, stood before the book of soil and pressed his palm into it. "When the ground begins to speak," he said, "we must not run. We must answer." And as he said it, the ground did tremble, the lanterns flickered, and somewhere beyond the fields, thunder rolled. Though the sky was clear, it wasn't weather, it was awakening. It started as a hum, low, almost imperceptible, like the vibration of something vast shifting beneath miles of soil. At first, the quiet ones thought it was thunder again, echoing across the flatlands. But the sky was clean, full of stars. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was rising from below. The ground itself had begun to speak. It didn't use words, not the kind men understand. It spoke in shivers, in soft collapses of dirt, in the breathing of roots. The sound would move underfoot like a living thing, circling the graves, pausing near the 13th. The soil pulsed there, expanding, contracting, as if exhaling slowly after a long, dreamless sleep. Elias was the first to kneel, pressing his ear to the earth. His eyes went wide. "He's still digging," he whispered. That night, they all heard it. The rhythmic scrape of a shovel beneath the surface, steady, tireless. A sound that should have belonged to a man, yet came from nowhere human. They lit no fires. They didn't pray, they only listened. For hours the scrape continued, fading and returning, like the heartbeat of the parish itself. By dawn, something had changed in the land. Graves that had sunken for years stood level again. The grass around the 13th grave grew thick and green, though the season had ended. And the river that cut through the backfields, once thick with mud, ran clear, cold and silver. It was as if the land had been cleansed. But the quiet ones understood cleansing always comes with a cost. Elias told them that Solomon was not dead, not in the way men die. He had merged with the memory of the soil. He became what they feared most. Elias said, "A man who cannot be buried." The others didn't question him. They simply returned to their work, digging, listening, and mapping new graves that appeared overnight, perfect in proportion, untouched by human hands. By the 7th night, the sound of shovels had spread beyond the churchyard. The plantation masters heard it too, drifting through their floorboards like whispers of judgment. And in their dreams, they saw Solomon, standing knee deep in the earth, face covered in dirt, eyes glowing with calm. He didn't speak. He only pointed down. It was midsummer when the whispers reached the big house. No wind, no rain. Just heat thick enough to make the night hum like a fever. The masters lay awake, sweating in their beds, listening to the strange rhythm that had haunted the parish for weeks. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't tools. It was slower, deliberate, scrape, pause, breathe. Then again, always the same, and between those pauses, a sound even worse, the faintest murmur, like someone speaking through the walls of the earth. At first, they thought it was the slaves trying to scare them, but there were no songs, no drums, no fires. The quarters were silent, yet the voices grew louder, crawling up from the foundations of their homes. They began to hear words, or what sounded like words. Their own names, drawn out in the damp air, whispered from beneath the floorboards. Rowan Price Delaney. Each name carried the weight of a grave. The men rose from their beds, grabbed rifles and lit lanterns, stumbling out onto the veranda. The fields stretched black under the moonlight, stillness everywhere. But when they stepped onto the soil, they could feel it moving. The ground pulsed, slow and deep, like a sleeping beast shifting in its den. They ran for the churchyard. The preacher followed last, clutching his Bible so tight his knuckles bled. And when they reached the cemetery, every grave was open, 12 neat rectangles, perfectly cut, waiting. The 13th was undisturbed, its surface smooth as glass, glimmering faintly beneath the moon. That's when the whispering stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, heavy, endless. Then the ground shuddered, and one by one, the open graves began to fill themselves. Not from shovels, not from hands. The soil moved like breath, rising and falling, covering the emptiness until the earth looked whole again. The masters fell to their knees. Some prayed. Some screamed. The preacher dropped his Bible, pages fluttering like dying birds. When he looked up, he saw footprints leading away from the 13th grave, barefoot, wet, and fresh. 12 pairs. By morning, the plantation was deserted. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just 12 new graves, smooth and silent. The 13th remained untouched, waiting. They found him wandering the road 3 days later, barefoot, wild-eyed, clothes torn and blackened with dirt. The preacher, the last man left from the night the masters vanished. He wasn't speaking when they found him, just mumbling the same phrase over and over. He's in the earth now. He's in the earth. The townsfolk took him back to the chapel, hoping prayer might restore his senses. But when they tried to open the Bible he carried, the pages were soaked through, not with rain, but with soil, as if the book had been buried for years. The letters had bled into one another, the word itself drowned in mud. And across the first page, scratched in with something sharp, was a phrase none of them had ever seen before. Balance demands its altar. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, slower, as if dragged up from somewhere deep beneath the ribs. "You think God lives in heaven," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "But he doesn't. Not anymore. He went where men told him to stay quiet. They thought it madness, but his sermons after that were nothing like before. He spoke not of salvation, but of symmetry. Not of sin, but of the ledger of the world. A cosmic account written in the veins of the earth. He told them every prayer was a seed, every lie a stone, and that both would one day rise again. You can bury guilt," he said, "but you cannot bury gravity." At night, he'd go to the cemetery and kneel by the 13th grave, whispering to it, listening. Some said he was praying. Others said he was answering. He began digging shallow holes around it, planting crosses without names. "For those who will join," he said. Then one dawn, the chapel bell rang by itself. The villagers found the preacher lying face down before the altar, not dead, but hollow, like something had been taken from him. The Bible lay open beside him, pages clean again. Only one verse remained legible, burned into the parchment. "The dust shall return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto the one who remembers." That night, the 13th grave shifted for the first time in years. A breath of air escaped it. Cold, ancient, patient. The first bloom appeared at dawn. It grew from one of the nameless crosses the preacher had planted, small, pale, and silent. No one saw it happen. The flower simply existed, trembling in the breeze, its petals the color of bone dust. By the end of the week, there were dozens. Each nameless cross sprouted a single white flower, perfectly symmetrical, growing directly from the wood as though the dead beneath had chosen to speak in blossoms. The townsfolk whispered that it was a miracle. The preacher called it a warning. "The earth is writing its scripture now," he said, standing barefoot in the cemetery, voice thin and broken, "and these are its words." But the flowers didn't stop. They grew even where no bodies had been buried, in the fields, near the wells, under the porches of the plantation houses. Each appeared overnight, always facing east, always trembling, when the wind carried the faint sound of shovels. The old ones said it was Solomon's mark, that he had returned not as man or spirit, but as a force of remembering. The quiet ones, now older and hidden among the workers, knew better. They gathered by night to study the pattern of the blooms, tracing lines between each cross until a shape began to form, a spiral, curling outward from the 13th grave, the same symbol Solomon had once carved beneath coffins long ago. And as the spiral widened, strange things began to happen. Tools rusted overnight, the river ran backward for an hour. Crows circled the church but never landed. The preacher tried to bless the ground, but when he poured holy water on the soil, it hissed like iron in flame. He fell to his knees and whispered, "The balance is breaking, the altar is full." That night the blooms turned crimson. Every single flower. The wind howled through the trees with the sound of 1,000 whispered names. The quiet ones stood in silence, understanding what the preacher could not, that the land was not punishing, it was correcting. The earth was reclaiming the weight it had borne too long. And in the moonlight, as the red petals fell like drops of blood upon the 13th grave, the ground gave a long, shuddering sigh, like a heart learning to beat again. They thought the spiral was only a pattern, something symbolic. But it was never meant to be seen from above. It was meant to be felt. By the second month, the ground across the old plantations began to hum, faintly at first, like a vibration too low for the ear, but impossible to ignore. Animals refused to cross the fields. Horses reared, dogs howled at the soil, and the men who still worked those lands began to hear the echo of shovels beneath their feet. Not digging down, digging up. It was the sound of reckoning returning through the roots. You see, Solomon had never truly buried those men. He had only given the earth permission to remember what it consumed. And memory, once awakened, seeks completion. The spiral beneath Louisiana's soil wasn't a map. It was a circuit, a design of burial and consequence, feeding on the weight of every unmarked death that had been pressed into the mud. The quiet ones began to trace it in secret, following the alignment of graves, rivers, and forgotten paths, until they reached a swamp that didn't appear on any map. It was there that they found what they called the hollow. Not a pit, not a sinkhole, but a breathing space beneath the world, where the ground itself seemed to inhale and exhale. The air shimmered with heat though the night was cold. And in the center, half buried in moss, they found something carved into the black stone. Beneath the muck, a spiral identical to the one Solomon had marked, but this one pulsed with faint light, like veins beneath skin. One of the men reached out to touch it, and his hand began to shake violently. He fell to his knees, whispering through clenched teeth, "He's still digging." The others ran. None spoke of it again. But days later, the same man was found at the edge of town, hands caked in mud, eyes open but blind, mumbling. The ground remembers the weight of injustice. His nails were packed with grave dirt. His footprints led back to the cemetery. From that night onward, the earth's hum grew louder. The spiral expanded, unseen but undeniable, linking every burial, every secret, every drop of blood ever offered to the soil. The balance was shifting, not toward destruction, but toward revelation. The buried were no longer silent. It began on a windless night, the kind where the air feels too still, too watchful. The moon hung over the cypress trees like a blade. At the edge of the old cemetery, the 13th grave, Solomon's final creation, began to move. Not burst open, not collapse, but breathe. The ground rose and fell in shallow waves, as if the soil itself were inhaling. No one saw it happen, but everyone felt it. Windows rattled miles away. Water trembled in basins. The preacher woke from a dream of drowning and whispered one word, "Return." By dawn, the grave had split cleanly down the center. Not dug, not broken, opened, as if from within. The coffin was gone, no bones, no traces of decay. Only a hollow space filled with dark water that reflected nothing. The quiet ones came first, drawn by the pull they'd felt since childhood. A call in their blood they didn't understand. They stood around the open grave and listened. From deep within the hollow, a sound rose. Not a voice, not a cry, but the rhythmic scrape of metal against soil. The sound of a shovel. For a long time no one spoke. Then an elder woman, her voice steady, said, "He's still working." The others nodded, their faces lit by the faint, pulsing glow rising from the water. They understood that Solomon hadn't been buried here. He had entered the ground, become part of it. He wasn't digging graves anymore, he was unearthing truths, pulling up the rot buried under centuries of silence. By nightfall, the townspeople began to gather near the cemetery, drawn by rumors of the impossible. Some came to pray, others came to watch. But when the first man tried to peer into the 13th grave, the earth beneath his feet gave a low groan. The crowd scattered, but the whisper lingered in the air. A low vibration that seemed to shape words inside their minds. All debts must be paid in the soil that hid them. That night, rain fell black as ink. It didn't soak the earth. It sank through it, and where each drop landed, the ground shivered like flesh. The 13th grave kept breathing, its pulse slow, deliberate, and eternal. Solomon had become what no man before him dared to be. Not the buried, but the awakener. The first to vanish was a boy, 12 years old, running errands between the chapel and the mill. Witnesses said he stopped mid-step, as if tripping on air. Then the earth opened beneath him, soundless, soft as breath, swallowing him to the knees before anyone could scream. By the time they reached him, only his hat floated on the surface of the dirt, spinning slowly as if over water. There was no hole, no collapse, just solid ground, still trembling. The soil had taken him, not out of malice, but memory. It didn't stop there. Men in the cane fields began to feel the land flex beneath their boots. Graves exhaled dust in the moonlight. Horses refused to cross certain paths, snorting and backing away from invisible thresholds. Every place Solomon had once walked began to move like muscle beneath skin. Those who tried to flee south found the roads flooded. Those who went north saw their lanterns go out all at once, as if the night itself had swallowed the flame. By the third week, the townspeople stopped speaking above whispers. They called it the slow drowning. Though no one drowned in water, they drowned in silence, in the weight of unburied truths pressing up from below. The preacher, once the voice of comfort, could no longer stand on his pulpit. The floorboards groaned beneath him. "We built our homes on bones," he rasped, "and now the bones want room to breathe." The quiet ones understood what was happening. The spiral Solomon left wasn't vengeance. It was a design for balance. Each life the soil had unjustly taken was reclaiming space, and those who had profited from the buried were being absorbed by their own inheritance. The living who carried the sins of the masters in their lineage began to feel it most. Dreams of mud filling their mouths, hands trembling as if remembering the weight of a shovel. In the dead of night, someone carved 3 words on the church door, "Therch remembiars." No one saw who did it, but every man who read those words felt something ancient stir in his chest. A memory that wasn't his, a guilt older than his bloodline. The ground no longer waited for prayers or confessions. It had begun its own. The gallows tree had stood dead for 50 years. A twisted cypress at the edge of the parish road, its bark bleached silver by sun and time. It had seen things no living witness could bear to recount. Beneath its limbs, men once begged for mercy while others cheered. Now, in the restless dark of Solomon's reckoning, the tree began to bleed. Thick sap, black as pitch, oozed from the old hanging branch and pooled at its roots like tar. And with it came the smell, earth, rot, and iron. By morning, the preacher was there. Barefoot again, robe torn, eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He called the people to gather, not in the chapel, but under that tree. They came, driven by dread and some unspoken need to witness. Around the gallows roots, the ground pulsed faintly, slow and rhythmic. The same pulse that beat beneath the 13th grave. The preacher raised his hands and spoke, but his voice didn't carry like before. It vibrated. The sound wasn't loud, it was deep, felt inside bone. "This isn't punishment," he said. "This is the sermon the soil gives when the living forget." His eyes rolled back for a moment, his body trembling as if a current were running through him. "The blood of the past still feeds the sugar in your mouths, the cotton on your backs. You buried the crime, but the crime was the seed. And now the harvest has come due." The people murmured prayers, but their words were swallowed by the hum rising from the ground. One man shouted for the preacher to stop. But the sound bent in the air, warping, folding in on itself. The preacher only smiled faintly, or maybe it wasn't him smiling anymore. "Do you hear it?" he whispered, the sound of the dead remembering their names. That was when the wind began, not from the sky, but from below. It rose through the soil, carrying with it voices hundreds layered in unison. Some wept, some prayed, some simply said, "We are still here." The gallows tree creaked as if bowing, and from the branches the rope, long rotted and forgotten, swung on its own, as though something unseen had stepped into it again. Men dropped to their knees. Women covered their ears, but the preacher only laughed through tears and said, "The sermon has begun." That night, the ground stopped pretending to be ground. It moved like a breathing creature, its skin of soil trembling beneath every step. The air was thick, trembling with that same humming that had haunted the gallows sermon. The town slept little. Those who did woke gasping, certain they'd felt hands brushing against their ankles, whispering names they didn't know, but somehow remembered. The quiet ones gathered again by the cemetery, lanterns low, faces drawn tight. They felt it before they saw it, the shift in the air, the opening of what lay beneath. Then, just before midnight, the earth began to split. Not violently, but with eerie precision. The soil peeled back like fabric being unstitched. One by one, faces began to rise from the mud. Not ghosts, not corpses, but impressions. The soil itself shaped into likenesses, forming cheeks, lips, eyes half open as if waking from centuries of silence. Men, women, children, the lost, the enslaved, the forgotten. Each face glowing faintly from within, as if lit by an inner flame. The unearthed dead had come not to haunt, but to be seen. The townspeople stood frozen. Some tried to run, but the paths bent back toward the cemetery. Others dropped to their knees, muttering prayers that melted into sobs. The preacher stood among them, his eyes glassy, whispering names as though reading from a book only he could see: Moses, Ruth, Elijah. Each name seemed to bring another face to the surface, another memory the world had buried beneath lies of civility and progress. But the faces weren't angry. They looked upon the living with a sorrow deeper than rage, a kind of ancient disappointment. They had been erased, yet they had returned to remind the living of their inheritance of cruelty and denial. When one of the old plantation descendants stepped forward, shaking, a face turned toward him. A woman's, her eyes filled with the calm of the grave. The man fell to his knees, whispering, "Forgive me." The earth around him softened, and the woman's ear pressed against the soil, as if listening. The hum deepened into a chant, one word repeated in dozens of tones: "Remember." The faces began to sink slowly back into the earth, but the glow remained, tracing veins of light beneath the ground. A map of every buried injustice. The town would never sleep soundly again. The first bell tolled at dawn. It was the iron one hanging in the old mission tower. Cracked for nearly 50 years, mute through fires, storms, and prayers, yet that morning it moved as if stirred by invisible hands. The sound was deep, uneven, mournful, like the breath of something waking after centuries of silence. Every soul in town heard it. Windows rattled. Dogs howled. Even the river, which had run sluggish and brown for decades, began to shimmer with black ripples as though the sound had reached beneath its surface. Then the second bell rang, this one from the courthouse, the same bell once used to mark slave auctions and executions. It joined the first in a low, resonant harmony. The air thickened, the vibrations made dust fall from the ceilings, pictures tilt from walls. People stepped out into the streets, barefoot, heads raised, unable to speak. The sound wasn't calling them, it was counting them. Each toll felt personal, like a reckoning. The bells were naming the living as witnesses to what could no longer be buried. By mid-morning, every bell in the parish, chapel, schoolhouse, plantation ruins, was ringing. No wind moved their ropes. No human hand touched their clappers. They rang in perfect unison, then broke apart into discord, echoing through every hollow and field. The noise became unbearable, yet no one dared to cover their ears. The preacher stood at the mission steps, arms wide, eyes closed. "The ground is speaking through the metal," he said, his voice trembling with awe. "Every strike is a heartbeat, every echo a name reclaimed." Children cried. The elderly knelt. The sky turned the color of tarnished silver. And just when it seemed the sound might shatter the air itself, the bells stopped. All at once. The silence that followed was immense, almost holy. Then, faintly came a different sound dripping. From the mouth of each bell hung thick, dark tears of mud, streaking their bronze sides like blood turned to earth. No one moved. The preacher whispered, "They've rung for the buried. Next, they'll ring for the living." And then, from deep beneath the town, came a low metallic hum, as if 1,000 unseen bells were beginning to wake below the soil, preparing to toll a final truth that no man could silence again. At noon, the world seemed to pause. Birds vanished mid-flight, the air hung motionless, and the cicadas went silent. Then, from the east bank, someone cried out. The river had stopped moving. What was once a steady current of brown water sat perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky like glass. People gathered along the edge, whispering prayers or curses, unsure which would work. A few brave souls dipped their hands in. The water was colder than it had ever been, numbing flesh to bone. Then, slowly, impossibly, it began to flow upstream. It wasn't violent. It was deliberate. The water slid backward, reversing over years of memory, carrying branches, bones, and forgotten relics toward their origins. Rusted shackles, teeth, bits of cloth, and fragments of wood. All surfaced, turning in the current like ghosts set free. The preacher knelt beside the bank, trembling, the river's unmaking time. He whispered, "It's washing back the sin." The others watched in awe as the current carried its strange cargo against the pull of the earth itself. Further down the bend, the remnants of the old slave docks emerged from the silt. The wood slick but intact, as if freshly built, the air filled with voices, soft and distant, humming an old field song. The tune rose and fell in perfect rhythm with the backward current. The quiet ones stood at the shore, holding their lanterns low, watching the river unwind its history. Then came the smell, copper and rain. The water darkened, no longer just brown but deep black, glinting faintly under the dull sky. Faces appeared in the current, not clear, but shadowed outlines moving with the flow, as if the river itself carried the souls it had swallowed. They weren't lost, they were leading something home. Children began to cry, sensing what adults refused to name. The preacher raised his hands again, voice hoarse but steady. "The river remembers where every drop was spilled," he said, "and now it's taking back the blood that was never mourned." When the last ripple passed, the water stilled once more, silent, reflective, ancient. Then, for the first time in anyone's memory, it flowed north to south again, but slower, thicker, as if heavy with all it had carried. On its surface, faint words shimmered in the current before fading into the depths. "We are not gone." 3 days after the river reversed its flow, The townspeople began finding things buried shallow in their gardens, fields, and roads. Not bones this time, tools. Old, rusted, ancient things that shouldn't have survived a century underground. Axe heads, chains, nails, and shovels. Dozens of them, all identical in shape. Their wooden handles were petrified but unbroken, their blades etched with strange spiral markings that glimmered faintly in moonlight. Every one bore the same crude carving on its handle, an S, that looked more like a serpent than a letter. Solomon's mark. The first to find one was a farmer repairing a fence post. When his spade struck something hard, he dug it up, thinking it a rock. But when the old shovel came free, the earth around it sighed, a deep exhale like relief. By nightfall, others began to surface, rising halfway out of the soil, as if pushed from below. No one dared touch them after word spread that the farmer's hands blistered when he tried to keep his. The quiet ones took the tools instead, wrapping them in black cloth and carrying them to the cemetery. There, under the 13th grave, the shovels hummed softly when placed together. The sound was low and constant, vibrating through the ground. It wasn't metal, it was voice. The preacher said the tools were never meant for work. They were symbols of what the dead had done in secret, burying not just bodies, but guilt. These were the instruments of concealment, he said. Now they've come back to uncover what remains. That night, a storm gathered without wind. Lightning flared behind clouds but never touched the earth. The air smelled of iron and rain that wouldn't fall. The quiet ones stood around the pile of shovels as they began to tremble, their blades turning toward the ground, as if yearning to dig again. Then one lifted, not by hand, but by something unseen, and drove itself into the dirt. The others followed, one after another, stabbing rhythmically, like heartbeats. The earth began to open. The preacher fell to his knees, whispering through tears, "He's still digging." The soil split wide, revealing a faint light beneath, golden, warm, impossible. The air quivered with the echo of Solomon's last words, carried up from the hollow. No grave stays closed when truth still breathes.